and who used these ewers in some of their rituals. These vessels were treated as heirlooms and venerated as magic. Sometimes bits of the pottery were broken off, they were buried, they were exhumed, ground up, and eaten. These ritualistic uses went on until the middle of the 20th century. Some of these ewers have also been found in Japan, where connoisseurs collected and appreciated these vessels as being in accordance with the aesthetic principles of the traditional Japanese tea rituals. I think her implication was that the Japanese collectors of later ages assumed that these were Japanese objects. So what made this little bizarre crayfish ewer so desirable in so many different places for so many different reasons? And even kind of more intriguing question, I think a more important question, is can we call it globalization? Or is it just a funny little story? I think it's not just a funny little story. I think she's onto something with this crayfish ewer as an agent of globalization. I think that what we see with the travels of these objects over time and among cultures is a really exciting way of understanding how globalization can be conceptualized through the specific travels of specific items connecting different times and cultures. And what are the effects of these? Here, these same objects in very different cultures have different values. Sometimes they're magical qualities, sometimes they're appreciated for the aesthetics, sometimes they're appreciated simply for the antiquity of the object itself. But I just thought it was a tremendously delightful story of the travels of an object, and again, as I'm saying, almost an agent of globalization. You can tell these stories of cultural connection in large terms about very important diplomatic missions and trading objects, and you can tell them with tiny little insignificant crayfish ewers that were produced in great numbers, almost disposable trinkets for the tourist trade. So I'm going to stop there. I did have one other example, but I think it's more important that we have a little bit of time for some questions. I did just want to say that I find that the value of interdisciplinary work, truly, at the end of the day, is that it helps you go beyond the received wisdom. You're not just telling the same story to yourself. You don't all have the same story if you're working in a group with people coming from different disciplines and different perspectives. I also think it forces you to work at the edge of what you know, and that's where things get really interesting. I've given you a couple of stories, tales of papers that were delivered at conferences at the Folger over years. I've been at the Folger for 18 years now. I've heard a lot of academic papers read at academic conferences. And I can tell you that it only gets interesting, or it always gets interesting, right at the edge of what somebody knows. There are all kinds of people who are going to challenge this point or that point, some small interpretive detail in whatever it is you're presenting. But I think the more interesting challenges, and they're not necessarily bad challenges, is, as I said, right at the end of your paper, right where you've stopped. That's where the question becomes, okay then, now we've got this down, how do we go on to the next piece? What's the next question that we can open up from here? Instead of closing things down, it's about opening up new conversations. I think that collaboration is incredibly important to interdisciplinary work. I do find, especially recently, that many people, no matter what their academic home is, if it's the English department or the history department, they're all trying to kind of bring on board the different ways of thinking from these different disciplines. But I also think it's especially helpful when you're working with other people in a group and formulating new questions. And I think when you're doing that, you're doing more than merging knowledge. Your mission statement talks about merging knowledge. I think you could change it. I think you're doing more than merging knowledge. I think you're creating new knowledge. with interdisciplinary studies. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope you've got some good questions. Yes.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what the Folger Institute offers for our undergraduates.
Yeah. Thank you. We have an undergraduate seminar. It's not the Folger Institute doesn't sponsor it, but never mind. Let's not worry about you know, what department, what things happen in which department. There is an undergraduate seminar at the Folger Library, and if you're interested in further information about this, you should take down Sarah Werner's email address that's there. At the bottom, swerner, W-E-R-N-E-R, @folger.edu. There's a seminar that's offered on Fridays each semester. There's one seminar in the fall, one seminar in the spring. Up to 12 undergraduates are admitted. It's a competitive admissions process. You should also talk to your advisor or have your advisor call Sarah or call me if you're genuinely interested in it, because there is not a fee for the individual student, but there are some charges for the sponsoring department or institution. But it's a wonderful opportunity that is pretty new for undergraduates to come into the library and do work. Now, if you had a project of your own that involved early modern humanities, and you weren't able, for whatever reason, to be in the seminar, you should also write to me. And there are possibilities to get limited reading privileges at the Folger if you have, you know, an honest-to-goodness research project that you can present and that you have a faculty sponsor who will speak to your ability to do work in the library. It is possible to get limited access as an undergraduate. Yes? Yep.
Dr. Petrovich, I didn't mention, was a psychobiologist.
Ah.
A question that he might ask, or at least I'm asking, from that perspective, is if you are holding one of these old books, there's a tactile, olfactory nature to that impacts the brain differently than if you're looking at it digitally.
Yes.
And I wonder if you've ever had anybody speak to that question, come to one of your workshops, and if so.
Oh, it's a really important question, and it also speaks directly to this shift in technologies today. There is a lot you can do with rare materials digitally, and the Folger is not the only research library by any means in the world rapidly trying to digitize as much material as it can, in as high quality as it can, to make it available to people. And if you cruise the Folger website, you will see there are big bodies of material that are digitized. But you lose precisely those connections that you're talking about. You also lose a basic sense of size or scale. So I was talking about that little woodcut. I kept saying it's a little woodcut. You know, it's a tiny little thing, but it's blown up big on the screen. One of the biggest digital projects involving books of the period that I work with is called EBO. I'm not sure if you have EBO here, do you?
Not anymore. We tried it for 2 years.
It's expensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive. I think you could go to the Library of Congress and work with EBO. But EBO is early English books online. It's based actually on microfilming that was done in the 1950s and 60s, and they simply digitized the microfilm. So they didn't, it's not new photography, it's not great, snazzy, high quality, but it's there. So you don't have to go to the Folger to read an early English book. If you wanted to read Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, you could pull it up on EBO, and you could, you know, screen through it and read it. But you're not going to know basic things like, is that a big book? Is that a tiny little book? And those things also convey information to you about how that book was used and who used it. EBO is not going to film something like that index that I showed you at the back of John Donne's poetry. It's got the text itself. If there's anything interesting happening on the fly leaves or anything added on at the end of the text, they're not going to show you that. So at all kinds of levels, from sensory to informational, there's stuff missing when you're reading digital objects. Yep.
Could you reflect a bit on the challenges of doing interdisciplinary work? Are things ever lost in translation from one discipline to another? And what the Folger does to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration?
What we do is we keep insisting that people have conversations with others in other fields. I mean, we really do organize most of our programs as interdisciplinary conversations. And our programs are available by application, not registration. So even your college professors have to apply to a Folger Institute seminar. And the application review committee has that agenda of organizing conversations amongst people who wouldn't necessarily otherwise converse and who don't necessarily approach these materials the same way. Yeah, there are challenges. There are turf wars, really. There are, and I would say, between historians and literary critics, it tends to be historians looking down on literary critics as kind of a softer discipline and not having the rigor, not having that historical background that they do. But what the literary critics can teach the historians is how to read the rhetoric, how to read the presentation, how to pay attention to the words that are used and the meanings of those words. So it's not just about extracting an argument, but reading the text carefully. Those are some of the typical problems that we face in putting together our, again, typical group of historians and literary critics. Yes?
You keep mentioning historians and literary critics.
Yeah.
Are there any other disciplines that come to the Folger?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different types of historians. So there are religious historians, religious studies people may well come. Social historians are going to have very different objectives from the BPT people. We do get art historians, but less frequently, and in large part that's because right down the street from us is the National Gallery. And the National Gallery has this wonderful fellowship center, and art historians are going to go to the National Gallery unless they happen to be working on precisely the kinds of visual materials that we have. And those tend to be works on paper, engravings and woodcuts. Early modern scientists. There's a growing group of people working on the history of science in the early modern period, and they may come to our programs. Alice?
You've been with the Folger for a long time, and I was wondering if you could talk about maybe changing attitudes that you've seen within the disciplines towards interdisciplinary work. Have you seen sort of a growth in interest towards it? Was there kind of some hostility or maybe skepticism about it 15 years ago?
That's a good question, and there definitely is a growing acceptance of interdisciplinary studies that I see at the library. Even from say 10 years ago to today, those kinds of turf battles that I was talking about, far less frequent now than they were 10 years ago. So that would be the major change.
And do you think the Folgers had a lot to do with that?
Oh, I would love to take credit. I do think that we're known for interdisciplinary studies. Yeah.
So among the
here at the Department of Biology, my field is bioinformatics, which is interdisciplinary biology definition. One thing that caught my attention is there's no, in the work, in cloud, there was no informatics or computer anywhere. I think that we use, for instance, people that works on natural language processing when we do text mining of scientific information. Very helpful. Combine some of those knowledge sometimes with the knowledge from evolution. When you study evolution and you try to trace back how those mutations happen, when you were mentioning these cases where you have many copies and things have been changed, this is exactly the same case where we have, to trace back and create phylogenies and such to figure out how we have evolved, how different species evolve.
Yeah.
So I imagine that I just mentioned linguistics, I mentioned computer science, evolutionary biology, like 5 or 6 other disciplines that I can mention. I saw when you get these questions here, I saw we're more narrow towards humanities or history. Do you actually incorporate? I see the word science in this word cloud, but it's very small. So how much of that do you incorporate in those types?
Well, I think I'd say a similar thing to what I just answered to Allison, that I see it increasingly coming into play. Work in the early modern sciences coming into play in our programs. There's also, at the Folger, a variety of opportunities for scholars to come and work at the library. The Folger Institute is traditionally the first step for a scholar into the library. You can come to a Folger Institute program as a graduate student. You kind of get your feet underneath you. You're working with a group of people on a common topic, a topic of common interest, and it sort of is your introduction to the Folger. But you can come to the library as an individual scholar, and we also have funded fellowships for, again, individual research. And the fellowships are a really important part of this whole picture, because the fellowships will allow somebody with a project that's a little bit off in left field and doesn't yet have a constituency built to come to the library, explore some overlooked corner of the collection, and produce a book, begin to have an influence, begin to turn the conversation in a new direction. So that can happen with what for us would be a fairly marginal field of science or medicine. Anatomies, there were some of the earliest anatomies were in this period. And there are the occasional scholars coming through and working with the materials that we have on some of those subjects, medicine, science.
Perhaps it would be nice to have some sort of statistics of how, in these sort of events that you have, how especially those where you are more open to other type of disciplines, how those disciplines have been going.
Right. And it could also be this a new fun visual. I'll just give you a little bit of anecdotal evidence about how I do see that sort of thing happening, that interest or a seed being planted and then it's sprouting a little bit. We had this conference on China. This is the first time half of the people at that conference had ever been at the Folger Library. They never had any reason to come to the Folger before. So we had a whole new group of first-timers at this conference, people working on China. In another couple of weeks, we have a conference on early modern translations. In the stack of applications for that program, we had about a half a dozen applications from people working on Chinese topics. None of the speakers at the conference are working on China, but those who had been in the Chinese conference went back home, said, hey, that's a good intellectual community. I found that was an important conversation. I'm looking for the next such opportunity. And I do see sometimes those scholars come into our programs that aren't even necessarily ostensibly addressed to them, but kind of forcing them open, forcing the conversation and discussion open. And yes?
One of the biggest challenges, I think, to this type of work is today, and probably always been, is showing its relevance to the so-called ever-dreaded real world.
Yes.
What sorts of things, if anything, is the Folger doing to engage in that kind of outreach?
Could I use China as an example again? The fact that the Folger is sponsoring an exhibition and a conference, and I think we had the Folger Consort also played Chinese music that same fall term. The fact that we're doing all of that is no accident. It has to do with the greater profile of China and today's world scene, a recognition that we can't be as kind of inner-looking and parochial as we might be, even at a library that we could completely defend a decision to restrict our programming to English literature. That would be completely defensible. And yet, it's somehow not right, and it's not right precisely because of the world we live in today. So the directions that we turn in with programming, I think often are reflective of pressing needs, social needs today, or new questions that come up because they matter in today's world. How much of a contribution is that? I don't know, but I think it's maybe small, but it's real. Yeah.
Can we go back briefly to your comment about digitizing the collection, which sounds like an enormously labor-intensive task? Were you ever tempted to partner with Google Books, or do you do this in-house? How do you make your materials accessible online?
Right. The Folger has not and probably will not in the near future partner with Google Books. There are some rare book libraries very much like ours who have. The American Antiquarian Society or Association in New England, I think, is doing just that kind of massive digitization. We're a small organization, and so we've started with limited projects. So most recently, we had a Picturing Shakespeare NEH grant, and it took a couple of grant-funded people to comb through the collection for images, any image associated with the Shakespeare play. Lots of them came out of editions of Shakespeare over the several centuries since he was first published. So you could look up Cleopatra and find 100 images of Cleopatra over time and in different productions. So that's the way we're going, with very targeted, relatively small-scale projects, at least for the time being. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention.